Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Digital Competition Conference, which has brought together researchers, policymakers, businesses, and civil society groups to discuss the frontier of technology and competition policy. Needless to say, these are complex and challenging topics involving nuances of technology, and antitrust law, and economic analysis, among many other factors. And yesterday had terrific sessions on the content that's critical for building sophisticated AI models, the changing international regulatory landscape, institutions that are central to competition policy, the intersection of competition with privacy and security, and how participants in tech markets act. Today, we're going to continue with a stellar lineup of sessions, and those will address antitrust litigation developments, the search and advertising markets, how AI and competition policy affect each other, among other topics. And we'll also have a really exciting set of lightning talks over lunch, showcasing cutting-edge research on technology and competition. The day is going to conclude with an interactive session led by Jonathan Cantor, former Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division at DOJ, exploring theories of antitrust harm in the rapidly evolving AI ecosystem. Our first session today is a debate about technology market ecosystems and competition, featuring two thought leaders in the space, Fiona Scott-Morton and Ioannis Lianos. Fiona Scott-Morton is the Theodore Nierenberg Professor of Economics at Yale and the School of Management. She also teaches at Yale Law School, now teaching antitrust law at Yale Law School. I didn't know they allowed economists to teach at law schools. Fiona's research just covers the waterfront of the economics of competition policy. She's been sort of a very influential figure in tech competition. In fact, my own research has been very significantly influenced by Fiona's work. She also has a distinguished career in public service, including previously serving as the chief economist at the Antitrust Division at DOJ. Ioannis Lianos is a professor at UCL and also teaching at NYU. And at UCL, he's the chair of Global Competition Law and Public Policy, and he founded and directs the Center for Law, Economics, and Society. He, of late, has been serving on the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal, and he previously served as president of the Hellenic Competition Commission. So a really stellar lineup to start the day, and I'll hand it over to Fiona and Ioannis.
Okay, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. So Ioannis actually has a formal scholarship, a book in this area. So we're going to set this up that I ask him a question, and then either I respond to what he says, or if I don't respond, he asks me a question, and we go back and forth like that. And then Xander will tell me when it's time to stop. Okay. So we're going to start out with what is an ecosystem. This term is bandied about a lot these days in competition enforcement. And I think there might be a variety of views on what it actually is. So why don't you begin? And I have one slide. Ioannis has several slides, so we'll hope that the people in the back can manage with that.
This slide here, which is a little bit what you said, Fiona. And first, thanks a lot for the organizers, for the invitation today. And whatever I say today is my own personal views, not, of course, the views of the tribunal. Let me say that, I don't know why it goes back. So I think, it is a concept that has appeared in a way in our competition law discussion, I would say early 2020, 2019. But it has appeared in some of the reports that were commissioned in the past. And you can see in this slide the number of times this was referred to in the reports. Now, most of the reports, they refer to this as a descriptive term, somehow to explain what is exactly, the ecosystem of Google or Apple, the major big tech companies. I don't think they engage with an operational concept of ecosystem as such. I think maybe one of the exceptions is the BRICS report, which has been focusing a lot on ecosystem competition and particularly ecosystem power. But still, I think at the time these reports were published, there wasn't really any academic writing in computational economics about ecosystems. So most of the research was coming from business strategy literature, dating from the 1990s. I mean, it started then being used more like a metaphor in a way of how the economy works, particularly to explain the modularity of the various, different self-production functions, and then how, different ecosystems started to emerge. But then I think there has been a quite important effort by the business strategy literature in the late 2017, 18 to define the concept of ecosystem. So there are many
Sounds
definitions.
dangerous.
Yeah, it's always dangerous to define, but in a way, to make sure that we all talk about the same thing, which I think is one of the issues. And I think probably the most important paper with regards to that is that by Michael Yakovidis, Annabel Gaver, and Senamo, who define ecosystem as following. It's basically a group of firms, which are independent firms. So it's a third-party ecosystem, which deals with, has super modular complementarities, and I'll explain a little bit what it is. And to a certain extent, it requires the existence of some governance structure, some alignment structure to bring together these firms that co-produce value. And in a way, I think there are four elements here that are very important. The fact that you have, independent firms, so it's not really, a supply chain in a normal way. Secondly, that you have some supermodular complementarities, which means that there are, assets or capabilities that are brought together. And because they're brought together, they are creating important value. And actually, the value that they generate together is much more than the value they will generate separately to a certain extent. And that is, the supermodular characteristic of the ecosystem. And also that you have some form of alignment structure, some kind of governance that somehow brings all that together. Now, that was a term that, of course, has to be understood in the objective of that literature is somehow, it's not really about the social value or how, the social value is allocated. It's more about, how the firms can develop profitability. And I don't think that literature engaged with the possible externalities of ecosystems. So I think part of that, of the discussion of competition authorities on the topic led to some economic work on ecosystems. But I think the idea is a little bit old even in economics, because you can think about, sometimes, some Xavier Vives' work back in the 1990s
I mean,
about
these are just
supermodularity.
complements. We would just say in
Exactly.
economics, this isn't a new idea. These are
Yeah.
firms producing complements, and therefore
But-
together they have a greater value.
They have a greater value. So, but in a way, this focus on supermodularity, which I think was present in economic literature in the 1990s, wasn't necessarily, I think, used that much in competition enforcement with regards to, the big tech platforms. And somehow the concept of ecosystem led to, I guess, some more emphasis from the lawyers on the way actually, these companies might generate value. These are complex systems,
Yeah.
and therefore we cannot apply just,
Yeah,
simple
so let me
economic
pause there. I
system.
don't think that competition authorities care so much about how a group of firms together generate value as much as thinking about the topics we're going to get to in a minute, like market definition, theories of harm.
Well, I mean, the way the value is captured and the
Yep.
way the value is generated, I think that is a concern as well for competition authorities.
You have to understand that to do your theory of harm. Yes. I
Yeah,
agree.
in order to either, do the theory of harm, or even at the earlier stage to determine, what is the topos of competition, where the competition takes place, right?
Yep.
So because it can take place in product markets, right, which is fine, and we have actually substitutability tool to define that. And I think there's no question that this is absolutely important. But then also you have levels of competition, either between ecosystems where I think substitutability is still very relevant, but then also you have competition within ecosystems, and I will come back to this, where actually substitutability might not necessarily be the right concept to deal with that. So, and that I think was the gap to a certain extent that competition authorities started filling the was in the economic literature at the time. And by using the term ecosystem, which was actually an empty concept at the time, because I mean, there was actually literature coming from business strategy saying one thing, then you have this old economic literature about singularity. But then, there was just feeling that something was missing, that it wasn't representing the power to a certain extent of these companies, right? And particularly the gatekeeping role, the rule-setting role that they had.
Yes.
And that is, I think, the problem that led us to think, oh, we need a concept for that. And the concept of ecosystem appeared naturally to a certain extent. It could have been another concept, but it was actually an offer. And we used this one. So it's a term, it's a concept that I think now it starts to get a little bit of operational kind of validity and momentum, exactly. But I think, we still have a lot of work to do.
May I put up my graph?
Sure.
So I don't know if the people
Thank
in the back can do that. No, don't worry, they'll switch it over. Yeah, so let me just say from the economist perspective, the idea of course, firms producing complements has been around for a long time. I would say that the distinction with an ecosystem is that you've got multiple firms, and in particular, usually there's a governance, but one of them's more important than the others. And in the digital platform case, it's the firm that's running the operating system typically, because we have an applications layer, we have consumers of various kinds, we have different functionalities that are going to be all connecting through or either directly or indirectly through the operating system. I'm just waiting. There we go. That was it. There, that's it. Okay. Here is a figure from a paper I wrote with Susan Athey a few years ago called Platform Annexation. And the graph on the right is just a visual of what I said. So you've got an incumbent platform, and then you've got third-party firms. That's very important. So if you're Apple and you're vertically integrated, Apple does have third-party firms making other things, but for instance, the device and the operating system are one. Here, if you thought about Windows or if you thought about Android, the device and the operating system are not one. Here's an example of platforms in the middle, an incumbent platform, and then maybe competition between platforms. And then there's tools on each side, there's buy side, there's a supply side. We could have more sides if we wanted to. And all of those firms are creating value together. And in this setup, I've got 3 platforms and there's nobody particularly in charge. So you could think about something like electricity in the United States, where you've got generation and transmission, and then you've got builders who put plugs in your house, and then there's a whole bunch of firms that make fans and computers and hair dryers and the other electric mixers, all the stuff that plugs into the other side. What's the governance of that ecosystem? It's the government, because the government either has running the restructured electricity market, is choosing the voltage that's allowed, is setting the plug shape, or the independent, the SSL has the plug shape. So there isn't anybody to behave strategically and take over that ecosystem. It's set by that governmental third party. The ones we're talking about today, the problem arises because you have a for-profit corporation owning, let's say, the incumbent platform. And if you got rid of the substitute platform and the entering platform in this diagram, it could be a picture of any of the digital platforms we've talked about today. So that then leads us to the possibility of very interesting strategies. I will disagree with Ioannis and say I don't think the economics literature and the strategy literature are at odds in any way. Normally the way it works is the strategy people notice something in the world, write an airport book about it, and then some clever economist like Julian comes along and writes a model of something. And so they're not different. They're just kind of different language.
I'm neither a business strategist nor economist.
Yeah,
so
the law, I have no opinion about what the lawyers do with this.
I can't comment on that, but the feeling we had though in our discussions, because this is a concept that has been discussed a lot, also in the context of the adoption of the DMA. I mean, even if it doesn't appear in the DMA, there was actually a lot of discussion in the negotiation of the DMA concerning Article 3, which defines what is a gatekeeper, and particularly there is a paragraph 8 of Article 3 that, apart from the quantitative thresholds that you have, has some qualitative factors that actually for the first time now, the commission has engaged with that, particularly with the cloud, because it's a way also to define what is a gatekeeper. And there was a discussion there about, putting ecosystem as one of the characteristics of a gatekeeper. That was rejected by the commission at the time, so they preferred to discuss about vertical and conglomerate type of
Yep.
links.
Now, can I just ask you about that? That seems very surprising to me because the whole DMA is built around this idea that there are business users and end users.
Yeah.
So by definition, once you have business users, you have an ecosystem.
Yeah, but I think the worry was that it was a new concept. It wasn't entirely clear, what exactly will mean. And they were not also, and I think they were afraid that companies might come up and say, well, we are not orchestrating an ecosystem, therefore we're not a gatekeeper. And that's an argument that actually TikTok used was designated actually ByteDance, particularly for certain core platform services. It appealed to the court, and there, they said, well, we're not, orchestrating an ecosystem. What are you talking about? And the commission, the court basically accepted and said, well, there's no, requirement to orchestrate an ecosystem so as to be considered as a gatekeeper. So it can go both ways. And actually, I think the concept, and I will come back to that, can be used both from the plaintiff side and, competition authority side, but also it has been used a lot as well by the defense side. Although, I will explain that the arguments they're using is very, very different and has, somehow, talk past each other sometimes. And
So tell me about this defense side argument.
so in a way, so if I can actually show one slide, if
Yep,
I, sorry,
yep.
I go a
Just
bit
go
late.
backwards. Yep.
All right. Yeah. So basically, if you think about what is, competition in the context of ecosystem, actually, I borrowed this slide from my co-author, Bruno Carballa, who is an economist. So, so there are 3 types of competition that we might think about. And competition here, I'm not necessarily thinking of this as, cross, like suscitability. For me, competition is, it's a social process, and I use a sociological definition, which is very old, basically. It's a social process in which you have economic actors, rivals, put on display their rivalry to conquer, convince an audience, right, or a third actor. This is Georg Simmel's definition back in, early 20th century. And basically, this, audience, the third actor can be consumers, can be investors, can be labor, can be whatever you want. So from that perspective, you can think of, you have competition between ecosystems, and there's a lot of discussion between, if Google and Apple are, substitutes.
So that's the lower right.
Exactly, that's a low right. And this is a little bit the arguments that many of the companies use by referring to ecosystem. And particularly, you can think of the Amex case, which is like the idea of the transaction platform. Why transaction platform? Because it competes with Visa and MasterCard.
Yeah, I mean, an MFN is problematic if you think you're competing between ecosystems, but we'll leave that to the
Yeah,
side.
I mean, of course, yeah, but
And then the top left
Then
is the 2 games competing for a user's attention within one ecosystem.
within the ecosystem, so you have, this is between ecosystems, and you have 2 forms of within ecosystems competition. The first one, which is still, based on substitutability, because it's actually the ecosystem
As is the lower
orchestrator.
right.
Yeah, as is the right.
Okay.
The ecosystem orchestrator, who is at the same time a platform and a merchant, and therefore competes with another merchant. And that obviously, is kind of familiar. And I think that the part of what I think is the gap that we have is that within ecosystem competition that goes beyond substitutability.
Okay, so that's the lower left.
That's
I
the
don't
lower left.
understand that one.
So let me explain that. I mean, so usually complements have not been considered in the classic business strategy, like Porter, as a force of competition, a force that might constrain profitability, all right? It's not among the 5 forces.
It is, because
Well-
substitutes are one of his forces, and the flip of substitutes is complement, so.
Yeah, well.
Economists would say it's in there.
substitutes- Well, substitutes definitely are, all right? So you can actually have an existing firm, you can have actually a potential entrant, you can have actually some kind of bargaining power from
No, so,
upside.
sorry, I have to stop you,
upstream,
just
downstream.
so that no one watching online is confused. the Porter five forces is about a demand curve and the space under the demand curve that's captured by the industry. He uses the word substitutes to reflect the demand curve. But in real life, it's just a demand curve, and anything that moves it counts as a force in the Porter framework. Complements move a demand curve, substitutes move a demand curve, wealth moves the demand curve, lots of things move the demand curve. So
Well,
it is there.
Well, that's not the view of Nalbuff and Brandenberger recently. I mean, in a paper they did, but
I'm pretty good friends with Barry. I
you
think
may disagree, but
he's on my side.
But
Yeah.
anyway, but the idea is that to the extent that you might have a complement that first, the complement competes with the orchestrator, right, with regards to the surplus value generated by the ecosystem. So who's going to get most of the surplus value?
Right. There's competition to extract the pie that is jointly
Exactly.
created.
So, and I think, that's an aspect that is not related to substitutability, okay? At least in the classic way. And secondly, you might have a complementer that is now a complement, that's not actually generating value, but, it might develop to, become basically through innovation or through the better technology or through, the development of, the consumer demand that's basically moving, towards, to become basically a disruptor, right, towards the orchestrator. And so this is a kind of within competition, within ecosystem competition that is not captured.
Yeah, I would
by
call it
substitutability.
dynamic, maybe, the dynamic
Well,
theory, because it's
part of
not
it-
happening instantly.
Yeah, part of
right?
it is dynamic because, the second aspect, the first aspect is not necessarily dynamic because it's actually about the capture of the value. It might be dynamic to the extent that you think that, well, we need to have the complementers also being able to make a buck and therefore, invest on R&D and develop innovation, etc. Or, you might have other reasons to value them. I mean, it could be, well, because they are offering, some choice or what, you can actually have different parameters. But certainly it's not something that is always dynamic, right? And I think this is probably the aspect of competition that the concept of ecosystem, I think, might provide some added value with regards to the concept of market definition, because it helps you to basically focus on that. And the thing is that, the defense in a certain way, they will always try to play with the ecosystem concept to bring the discussion under inter-ecosystem competition. I mean, the down right? And this was exactly the case, in Amex. This is exactly what happened, in the Epic versus Apple, Epic versus Google. It's exactly what happened. It's basically in all the cases, in Google Android, or, there's every time like this. While I think the other dimension of the concept of ecosystem, which has been used mostly by the competition authorities, but because, they haven't really conceptualized that fully so far, they have been relying a lot on the concept of aftermarket, right? Single product aftermarket. Is they basically try to use that concept, which was not developed with, the idea of an ecosystem at the time, in order to deal with the situations of capture that you do have in the left down, right? And I think that's a kind of, when you look at the narratives of the cases, these are the two competing narratives, which I think is a little bit narrow. I mean, from the perspective of the competition authorities and eventually the courts, this use of the concept of aftermarket, in a way. And I think it's better to just directly, use the concept of ecosystem.
Okay. All right.
Sorry,
so
I've
let
been
me
a little bit
respond.
long on
Yeah,
that.
let me respond to that. I would say that the two theories that you describe in the lower left are actually quite distinct from the economist perspective. One of them is a competition story, which is a dynamic competition, which is I am a complementer on a platform in an ecosystem, and I have such a good idea that I'm growing and I'm going to morph into something that either disrupts your platform or becomes a new platform. So if you look at the state's complaint in what was then the Facebook case, the one that the judge said states are not sovereign entities and they don't get to they have a statute of limitations like regular people. So threw it out. But that, and I was, oh, I didn't do my disclosures. I was the expert for the FTC, sorry, for the states in that case where the FTC kept going, but the states were shut down. And I don't think I have any ecosystem theories. I do consulting for governments and for private parties. I'm the economist for the class representative in the UK in a Google ad tech case, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's much to say about ecosystems there. So going back to my point, the complaint that the states filed against Facebook in 2020 has exactly this dynamic theory of harm. It says, look, you could be Vine, for example. Facebook's trying to make its platform more interesting. It has games and things that you can do on it. Those are provided by third parties. They connect, they have APIs. And when one of them gets too good and exciting and seems to be forming its own social network, Facebook cuts it off because they're exactly afraid that that thing could take off and become its own separate source of competition. So I think that's a very good and sensible, easy to describe theory of harm. The question of when all the complementers come together and create value, how do they split it? That's a very important issue, but it's not the same as competition the way we think about it in antitrust and competition economics. It's about considering your added value, and this is where the Brandenburg-Nailbuff work is so important, and they call it dividing the pie, and it essentially has to do with what the size of the pie is if you leave. So if you provide a game on a platform and there's a zillion games just like you, if you leave that ecosystem, nothing really happens to the size of the pie. So you can expect to get not very much, get paid very little for your contribution because your contribution at the margin is small. On the other hand, if you're a really unique and distinctive game that millions of people love and they go to the platform to get that game, then if you withdraw from that ecosystem, that's a big blow, and that means that the ecosystem loses, and therefore you are going to get paid your marginal product, which is your contribution to the ecosystem. That's a well-established literature, but I would not call that the same as the competition that we normally think about.
I mean, it's not the competition that the economists normally think about, but it doesn't necessarily mean that lawyers shouldn't think about that kind of competition, right? So, and what I would like to say is that, think about, and there's a lot of work by Barabasi, for instance, and other, network science people about, the hubs, in a network. So a network is not really that everyone is equal, right? So you have some very, very important hubs. And when these leave, that could be a major change, right? And I think that is something, therefore, we should care about, right, to a certain extent. And that is, I think, and that's why I think to deal with the issue of ecosystem competition, of course, we need economists, right? But we also need other people as well, maybe, social network theories, I mean, business strategies, of course, Michael will be very upset if I don't say that it's very important as well for competition enforcement. So, and it's because, basically we need to develop, graph theory, et cetera, which is kind of pretty classic in network science, in order to be able to develop this lattice, this kind of network, right? And understand, the competitive interaction that happening, because the value here might be, and the source of the value doesn't necessarily mean that it's a profit in the classic sense, right? It can be asset, stocks evaluation, right? It could be, how much you're positioning, in that network, in that lattice, and the fact that you are actually, the way the complementarities work, what you're bringing in, your capability is super modular, right? What the others are trying to do is to commoditize you and basically to make sure that they become super modular, right? But that's a kind of competition that drives, I guess, the real competition because, this is really, the importance of, market valuation, who is going to be the positioning in the, the central position in that lattice in a way. And I think that's a kind of incentive, basically, that framework that CEOs have, right? So when they adopt competitive strategy. So if we ignore that, it's as if we ignore a significant part.
No, nobody's ignoring it.
No, I'm not saying I'm accusing anyone to ignore, but I'm saying if we ignore it abstractly, it might be, an issue. So we're not necessarily going to have to deal with real competition. We probably
Yeah.
deal with a 101 economics competition, but that's not necessarily what we're interested in.
Okay, I would say that the way, what we always care about in competition is head-to-head competition. That's the thing that drives consumer choice and price quality and innovation. Sometimes head-to-head competition is disrupted or affected by adjacent markets, related markets. And here you have that on steroids. You have several related markets. So it is certainly the case that when we're developing our narrative of our theory of harm, we have to take into account the way those markets interrelate. And so let's just do a theory of harm, because I feel like we've been talking in the abstract for a while. Let me go back to my picture. So this is a picture, if you got rid of the, well, don't get rid of anything. If you took that picture and just thought about Google Ad Tech, for example, you would say there was a tool and it was called DoubleClick for Publishers. And that tool multi-homed across multiple ad exchanges. And the publishers therefore could seek out the best deal, high price, better placement, whatever it was that they valued. And when you have that tool be bought by Google, the demand side on the other side of the market, and it could then make that tool cease to support multi-homing and instead be better integrated with its own ad exchange, more liquidity, faster times, fees for the other ones. Then what you get is, instead of a tool that's working on behalf of publishers, you have a tool that's working on behalf of Google, and that disrupts this otherwise pretty good ecosystem that was there before into something that is controlled by the dominant platform, and reduces the surplus going to other parties and excludes other kinds of competition like the substitute platforms. So that's a way to articulate a theory of harm, taking into account the market reality that we have this complicated set of complementers all jointly producing a valuable product. So that's where I would go with it. I'm kind of, I don't often see the gain to a lot of definitions and formality, because then you spend all your time on that and not on trying to explain what actually happened that harmed somebody.
I agree with that. I mean, in the sense, yes, but the problem is that courts, usually competition authorities less, they are focusing a lot on the market definition aspect of cases, right? And that is sometimes might seem contradictory to a certain extent, right? I mean, I don't want to make any criticism, et cetera, but I mean, look to Epic Apple, Epic Google, same court, actually saying, well, we're consistent. Doesn't look extremely consistent to me, but I mean, it's, you know, personal view, not offense the court. So, and I think, you know, maybe having this concept of ecosystem and actually helps you to just focus on the power element, which I think is the important thing. You know, what type of power we're talking about.
Did the publishers want to have their multi-homing disrupted? Probably not.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about power, and I think I have something to show.
Let's go backwards.
Go backwards there.
Yeah.
Let me just see. Yeah. So if you think about power, I mean, you can actually the power the concept of power we have is based on economic dependency, right? So, and that's the kind of a class, and I think it's very, very useful. What actually we're saying in a paper with Bruno Cabala is that there are other forms of power as well that we might be interested in, particularly, you know, the fact of, which the positioning that you have in the network, right? How much access to information you have.
So you have it written down in one of our prep questions about measuring market power. Do you have some ideas about that here?
Well, I mean, that's why, you know, I'm saying it's not going to be a call that only economists from social scientists will answer, but eventually other social scientists as well. So I've been starting doing work a little bit, but it's too early with network scientists and, you know, using graph theory to eventually understand the position of network. In our paper with Bruno, we use actually classic betweenness centrality type of concepts. And we actually applied that to a real case at the Greek authority with regards to supermarkets and suppliers, which is kind of a, you know, simple ecosystem to a certain extent and to try to assess the positional power. But I guess, so what I would like is a discussion to focus not so much about the market definition, like the sort of pigeonholing things.
I don't think that's, yeah.
But basically on the power elements and then being a little bit, but the courts, as far as I understand, particularly the US, they are very much, spending a huge amount of energy and resources on market definition.
Yep.
In Europe, I think, and I have to say, it wasn't easy to bring in the concept of ecosystem in the European competition law discussion. But, there has been some significant progress. I mean, we have the recent European Commission market definition notice that was adopted in 2024, negotiated in 2022, actually. It has a specific now section on digital in brackets, because the idea is that, well, we discuss, it's not just about the digital economy.
Right,
And
of course.
many of the platforms, are hybrid as well. Right? So it could be for any, I mean, Nespresso can also be like sort of
Yep.
an ecosystem, right?
Well, although if they make their own pods, then maybe not.
Well, but they rely not only on their own pods. I mean, they also have compatible, pods, etc. So, but again, still, if you look at the way the Commission defines it, it actually focuses on consumption complementarities, while, I think it's important to focus on both consumption and production complementarities. So I think that is an issue. And also, they basically very much inspired by this aftermarkets kind of narrative, which, I mean, it could be interesting for one part, I mean, one dimension of power, but it's very much resource dependency type of power, and it doesn't necessarily, capture other forms of power that we discuss in our paper, like, for instance, positional power. So, so that, I think, is an issue. Now, and interestingly enough, the Court of Justice now engages with the concept of ecosystem. I mean, in the General Court, we'll see what the Court of Justice will say. I mean, this is General Court in the Google Android case, where basically they're saying, well, an ecosystem is a collection of relevant markets. So it goes a little bit your way in the sense,
Yeah, no, this one
so they
makes sense
can't-
to me.
Exactly. So they can't really, avoid the relevant market concept. My question is, what exactly is the added value of that relevant market concept when you think about ecosystem? All right.
Oh, because the law requires it. So we
Well-
want a simple way to think about relevant markets, and we don't want to try to make the ecosystem as a whole the relevant market, or we are exactly going to omit a lot of the strategic behavior that we're worried is actually harmful.
But I don't think the law requires it. I mean, in Europe, the way
Sorry,
you
in the
define-
US it does usually.
In the US, yes, but actually, they define the concept of market definition as where you have the effective competition. All right. So some cases, particularly I think the Epic Apple case, they say where there's substitutability, they use a concept of substitutability. So that's pretty limited. In other cases, I mean, and definitely the Amex case, and there were a lot of criticism about that. I mean, they just don't, necessarily define that this is precisely about substitutability, right? They say is where effective competition happens. Effective competition might happen in a market, might happen in a system. And again, it's not necessarily, in Europe, it's not, thank God, a requirement as such, to the extent that the concept of dominant position has been defined by the Court of Justice as, the possibility to act independently from the competitors, customers, etc., which is a little bit broader. And although, in the Commission guidelines on Article 1, the draft guidelines 102, they don't mention ecosystems at all. They focus on market definition. There was actually even the ECN, and I can talk about now, a declaration that we issued about the importance of market definition. But the language, actually, you have to be careful about the declaration. It's not really that it says it's necessary, right? It says it's helpful. Right?
Market definition,
Yes.
yes.
So there's more openness
Okay,
from that side, and I think and I will basically be in favor of what Breyer said in Amex. I mean, he's the dissenting opinion. I mean, you have direct evidence of anti-competitive harm. I mean, why do you
why do you need to spend a lot of time on
to spend money
definitions?
on market
Yes,
definition?
yes,
Exactly, yeah.
exactly. Okay, well, that seems like an excellent place to end.
Okay.